on today's episode of The Mythic Masculine.
You can look at the poetry and look at the myths and see it transform from the earlier times where there's this beautiful religious poetry where the goddess Inanna is singing the praises of her vulva, right? And also of the sacred marriage with Dumuzi, the god, and singing, at your mighty rising, the vines rise up and the fields rise up, and this idea of male sexuality as bringing nature alive and female sexuality as the waters that fertilize and nurture everything in life, to the later myths where the great god Marduk literally dismembers Tiamat, the great serpent goddess, and creates the world out of her dismembered body. And I often feel like that's the world we live in now, is this dismembered world where we've forgotten that the well springs of life are in the living world itself. And to honor that,
what does it mean to be a man today? And what is masculinity reclaimed from the toxic paradigm of domination and empire? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential uncertainty, how can we draw upon the lens of mythopoetics to navigate the terrain of imaginal possibility? This podcast explores the historical, cultural, and contemporary voices that are once again realigning masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. My guest today is the renowned Starhawk, a writer, activist, permaculture designer, and teacher, and leading voice of ecofeminism and earth-based spirituality. She is the author of 13 books, including The Spiral Dance, The Earth Path, and The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups, as well as the visionary novels The Fifth Sacred Thing and City of Refuge. She also directs Earth Activist Trainings, which combines regenerative design with spirit, social permaculture, and activism, offering courses both online and in person. In our conversation today, we begin with acknowledging the fires that have ravaged Los Angeles. We explore how the frame of ecofeminism connects this tragedy to how unequal power relations affect all aspects of life, with violence against women reflecting a similar disrespect for the earth. Starhawk eloquently explains how we might challenge these systems of oppression, offering frameworks for compassion and transformation. We delve into the misinterpretations of feminism, the role of mythology in shaping cultural narratives, and how visionary fiction can illuminate paths to a sustainable future. Her novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, is a central inspiration for our discussion, particularly the exploration of how creative nonviolence might confront a fascist regime and lead to true societal transformation. We also consider the role of men in social movements, focusing on the cultivation of authentic power, responsibility, and the capacity to truly love. A heads up, you're invited to check out my website to explore upcoming in-person and online offerings, as well as how to become a paid Substack supporter. I don't accept advertising and rely on listeners like you to fund this show. Visit themythicmasculine.com for details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Starhawk. Welcome, Starhawk, to the show.
thank you, Ian. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I love to start on my interviews by asking my guests to share a little of where they are in this moment, well, geographically, spiritually, if you'd be willing.
I am right now in a place currently called San Francisco, but originally called Yalamu, the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone, right on the edge of the continent where the land meets the sea, and we're this little thumb of foggy land that sticks up with the bay on one side and the ocean on the other. And it's a beautiful sunny day after many days of rain here. Feeling grateful for the rain and very sad for friends of mine in LA right now who have suffered from the fires and all the people who have lost their homes We feel lucky up here in Northern California that the rains came early enough to end fire season. But it's a kind of mixture. I'm feeling a lot these days where my own personal life is like fine and happy and beautiful and so much to be grateful for. And in the world around us, there's just so much loss and sorrow and tragedy and hatred. It's always like a dark undercurrent.
Yeah, thank you for naming that. I've also been getting dispatches from friends in the LA area as well, and some have likely lost their homes, been displaced, and just the surreality, is that the term for it, right? The surreal nature of that house could be there one moment and then gone the next. And yeah, it feels so much a sense of the times that we're in, which is, again, increasing lack of certainty, if there ever was. But even more so, right, the rate of change seems to have picked up quite a lot. And I think we're going to touch on a number of themes in this conversation, and we're going to talk about the role of visionary fiction and mythology, as well as, though, I think some of the ground definitions of some of the themes and the territory that you've given so much of your life to. And one of those is the term ecofeminism, that I'd actually love for you to just unpack a little bit, because I know it's been attached to you for a while, and perhaps you are known as one of the leaders of the ecofeminist movement. And yeah, I'd love the listeners to get a sense of that, because they may have heard that actually, ironically, for the first time, some of the listeners. Yeah, if you would.
Yeah, I mean, ecofeminism is the understanding that when we live in a world of unequal power relations, they impact all aspects of life in different ways. So that when we live in a world where power is distributed by gender, then the way that violence is inflicted against women just is reflected in the way we inflict violence on the earth and on the climate and on our disrespect for the life support systems that actually sustain us, which we're seeing the impact of right now with the fires and the horrific floods we had earlier in the year. So it's this idea that you can't separate out like one ism, that they all work together. And it's not about women being good and men being bad. It's about structures that are bigger than all of us, that push us into certain limiting boxes that are, of course, different for women and different for men and different for those who don't fit those categories, but are restrictive for all of us and aren't really liberating for any of us. And that we all have a vested interest in challenging those structures and creating a world that is both freer and also more caring and more compassionate, where we can recognize our interdependence.
Beautiful. I'm struck by the misinterpretation that I think a lot of either critics or those feeling reverse oppressed upon, i.e. men in certain spheres. I know I've touched on the manosphere sometimes on this podcast, right? And oftentimes you have this position, which is that feminism is the problem, right? According to that side of things, right? And for me, that's always struck me as ironic that there's something else bigger than the sort of myopic focus on, if men feel they're being blamed, men are the problem. Therefore, wait, women are also the problem. It's this kind of too small, narrow view, right? And I think what you're speaking to is, another term might be hyper object. You might have come across that term too a little while ago. But I'd love for you to offer your take on that, of like, what is the hyper object that is actually more important to be looking at than some sort of narrow gender polarity issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think men, especially young men, are really being sold a bill of goods right now by the alt-right and the manosphere. And it's tragic because it's not actually going to empower men. And to be crude about it, it's not even going to get you laid. I always say, if you want to be attractive to women, there's one infallible way to do it, and you don't have to look a certain way. You don't have to go out and lift weights. You don't. have to be a great hero. You can be a funny looking, nerdy little guy, but if you do this one thing, it's going to make you extremely attractive. And that's simply actually paying attention to women, to whoever you're with, actually getting interested in who they are as a full person, actually focusing your attention on them instead of on you. And believe me, that will get you connections, relationships that are far more fulfilling than anything you're going to learn by these guys who themselves obviously have some serious problems. Yeah, right. And again, it's not that men are the problem. And I think there have been feminists and women in the women's movement who've, the simplest way to look at things is this group good, that group bad, us and them. We are the ones who count, and those are the other ones. But that simplistic kind of definition doesn't really work well, and it's the root of all different oppressions. I've just actually finished a section. I'm writing a book on Substack called The Movement We Need, about how do we actually build a broader based, more powerful, more welcoming progressive movement. And that is being able to create a sense of belonging for people. And the easiest way to create a sense of belonging is to say, we belong and you don't. And that's what the right has been doing very effectively. But that's not ultimately something that's going to liberate any of us or all of us. We need to find a way to create a big enough we that we can all belong to it. And that includes women and men as well. And that means looking at the ways that these systems and these structures have been oppressive to men as well as to women. And you mentioned Riane Eisler in The Chalice and the Blade. She talks about the transition in ancient Greece from a more partnership, matrifocal culture to patriarchal culture. And that's something I've written about a lot in one of my earlier books, Truth or Dare. I looked at it in Mesopotamia. You can look at the poetry and look at the myths and see it transform from the earlier times where there's this beautiful religious poetry where the goddess Inanna is singing the praises of her vulva. Right? And also of the sacred marriage with Dumuzi, the god, and singing, at your mighty rising, the vines rise up and the fields rise up. And this idea of male sexuality as bringing nature alive and female sexuality as the waters that fertilize and nurture everything in life, to the later myths where the great god Marduk literally dismembers Tiamat, the great serpent goddess, and creates the world out of her dismembered body. And I often feel like that's the world we live in now, is this dismembered world where we've forgotten that the well springs of life are in the living world itself. And to honor that means, again, it's not determined by your genitalia or the gender you identify with. There are elements that sustain all of life that are important to all of us, and where we can all draw a sense of nurturing and resilience and enlivening kinds of power.
What do you make then of the recent election of Donald Trump once again? And I know you've written about it on Substack. This episode will come out probably just after the inauguration. And for you, what did you see as the kind of deeper themes going on beyond the personality cults and all that kind of stuff? As one who's also tracked social movements and the ebb and flow of justice and fascism and all this stuff too. I'm curious, what were you seeing reflected?
One of the things I really keep coming back to is just the level of disinformation, and it's even more than disinformation. It's like this almost paranoid fantasy world that's being spun to us as the reality. There was just this guy that blew himself up in a Tesla truck in front of a Trump hotel and wrote some kind of manifesto saying the world is going to hell, the country is going to hell, all of that stuff. Trump is talking about waves of horrible migrants taking over towns and gangs and all that. Well, the reality, I live in San Francisco, one of the most diverse cities on earth. Every year we have a celebration for Dia de los Muertos, for the Day of the Dead. This year it was right before Election Day. It's on November 2nd. Thousands of people in the street. Most of them look like the people Trump wants to deport. Altars everywhere. We have a procession with thousands of people. Everybody's out there. It's a day that's become a celebration that's not just limited to the Latinx community, but involves so many people from the whole city because everybody has people we mourn. Everyone has ancestors, everyone has beloved dead. And there were beautiful altars and processions and performances and rituals and dance parties all over my end of the city. And it was entirely peaceful. And I kept looking around going, here's thousands of people in the streets. And you don't even see the police because they aren't needed. And this is the actual reality of a diverse community. So we've got, it's like we're fighting this phantom of people's paranoias. And I know there are just huge swaths of this country in the US where the only real news source people have is Fox News, where the local newspapers have died, where the local community no longer gets together in the same way that they used to for a variety of reasons. And COVID made that worse. So it's almost like we got to counter these phantoms with the actual positive reality. Even looking at men and women. I teach permaculture. I also have land in the country where I live part of the time. And I see the young men out there, and these are men who buy all like all traditional sort of stereotypes are manly men with chainsaws and muscles and pickup trucks. And there are also men who are like carrying their babies around in backpacks or spending hours jumping on the trampoline with their kids and digging their gardens and figuring out how they're going to tend the land and care for the land, or how they're going to protect their neighbors in case of a fire. And I keep thinking that's the reality of masculinity at its best. All of the toxic manosphere stuff is, again, it's like a phantom that someone's projecting out there. So I think our challenge in these next 4 years, first, is to survive them, to protect the most vulnerable communities, and also, again, to figure out how do we create a more powerful movement that can be broader and more inclusive, and that can be more welcoming, so that we can actually marshal enough power to bust through the phantoms and grow and create this more beautiful reality that is the real possibility of having a truly diverse and multiracial democracy.
You brought up this question of what to live into, right? Or maybe I could see also like a crisis of a story to be invited into. And I just speak for men. I have a close friend of mine. He teaches at colleges, often special classes around careers and purpose and things like that. And he said to me one time, he came up, or a young man came up to him. I think he must have been probably early 20s. And my friend, who's a white man like me, but also he went on this wacky adventure and he tried all these different jobs, and he has a powerful story to tell and inspiring. And he said a young man came up to him and just said to him, "Hey, after his talk, I just need to know, how do you live with yourself as a white man?" Right? Like, and the kid was also white, because then that level of kind of like, aren't we like the worst thing ever? Right? Based on what it seemed like a lot of the left has painted. And again, I'm not holding that up as some kind of standard, but it's like, I see the crisis there, right? Of here's maybe a young guy who sees the troubles of the day, right? Sees the way men have perpetuated all sorts of things, wants to be engaged with it meaningfully. And yet the image he's painted is, you've had it easy and now you don't matter and all the rest. So it seems obvious then the right would say, hey, come to us. You'll be powerful over here. You'll feel strong over here. You'll get back at them over here. So I use that as an image that came up. But I also pulled up an interview, which you were quoted in years ago, I think, from Shepherd Bliss, which, you might have found it here and there. But when I was researching, I was like, oh, interesting. So Shepherd Bliss, by the way, to the listener, he's apparently attributed to coining the term the mythopoetic men's movement, which is something that Robert Bly as well. I'm not sure if you ever met Starhawk, but he also didn't like that term. Like, he actually wanted to call it the expressive men's movement, right? About waking up and tapping back into emotions and all that stuff. And Shepherd, he coined the mythopoetic. But there's an interview where he says he was at a men's conference. I guess it would have been in the 80s maybe, but he said, you're quoted at this, where he says he overheard a woman speaking. Somebody said, the bus driver, men are such interesting creatures, they're all mysterious. Yeah. Again, I don't know if that was you who said it or was it another woman there, but you apparently were there. He said, yes, you, or maybe his attributing to you, said, you looking for or inviting men who are wild without being cruel, angry without being violent, sexual without being coercive, spiritual without being unsexed, and able to truly love.
It sounds like something I might have said.
Yeah, he quoted you saying that, and again, in what you're saying, I'm curious, as you hear that now, what comes up for you? Because that feels what you're speaking to, like an image to invite men into.
Yeah, I believe there are really positive images for men. Part of it is to understand that there are different kinds of power. There's power over, which is coercive power, or power that is rooted in institutional hierarchies. And we all deal with that every day. It's not always negative, but it's just one sort of power. And then there is what I call power from within, which is our inner power, our integrity, our spiritual power, our creativity, our ability to do things and learn things or take courageous actions. And that kind of power is not limited. And that kind of power is always open to you, no matter what your gender might be. And then there's a kind of power we might call influence or rank or power with, or social power. That's how much your voice is listened to, how much you're respected. And that kind of power can be earned. If you think about elders in a traditional society that earn that respect by their long lives and their experience and their track record of making good decisions, it can also be unearned. And I think you get just by the virtue of, oh, he's a man, he must know how to fix my car engine. Right. And I think the feminist movement has challenged that unearned social power along with those structures of hierarchy. But that doesn't have to be disempowering to a man or a woman of any, or any person of any gender that has that internal power, that personal integrity. That's not threatened by saying, we're no longer going to allocate to you this unearned social power, but we are going to offer for you a chance to fairly earn social power. And that's one place where I think sometimes we call the movement. Somebody asked me, what do I mean by the movement? I say, like all of the movements that you could put together as people together struggling for justice. All those different If we think of that as an ecosystem, then there can be a niche in that for everybody. But I think too often the movement has not been clear enough about saying, hey, we're asking you to give up that privilege, that unearned social power. But in return, we're going to offer you ways that you can fairly earn social power. And really, that feels better. Like we all like to think we deserve such power and respect as we have. And it's pretty pathetic if the only way that you feel you have power or value is something kind of extraneous, like your skin color, and not something that goes back to the choices you made in your life and the things that you've learned and the things you've put yourself behind and stood for and worked for. And I do believe there are plenty of ways. Like a young friend of mine, also a young white man, one point said to me, I'm not sure about the role of white men in the movement. It's my role. And I think there are multiple roles. For one thing, there are certain things only white men can do, which is sometimes talk to other white men and actually model support for the strength and the ideas and the value of all of those groups of people who are not white men. That doesn't have to undermine your value. Again, if you cultivate your power from within, I think there are ways in which coming to terms with privilege, coming to terms with the kinds of oppression, the structural oppression in society can be very painful, especially if you come from the group that has wielded privilege and you have a conscience. And I think that's where men can be of service to other men, is by being support around that and understanding that and helping other people through that and showing them again that there are very positive paths to power and respect and social power that don't have to involve domination and coercion.
This makes me think of the world in your book, which this is the fifth sacred thing, right? The novel, a fiction novel that you wrote. I believe it was in the early 90s, I think it was published.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I read it for the first time last year, and my partner read it a while ago, and it's been sitting on the shelf for a while. And I was like, I got to get to this. I got to get to this. So I finally read it last year and was astounded. I was deeply touched by it and many parts of it. And I'm curious, and I know that you followed it up with The City of Refuge, which I have not seen it, or have not read it, that one yet. I did look up the premise. But I'm curious for you, why did you choose to write a fictional book? And what was one of the intents of it, if we're now talking about the role of, in a way, trying to make visible a kind of world that you're speaking to here? And what are the forces at work that you saw needed to be confronted, but in a way that you were trying to, in a way, demonstrate something of possibility?
Truthfully, I'd always wanted to write fiction. I'd written other fiction that I hadn't succeeded in getting published before I started writing nonfiction. And in the 80s, I had written Truth or Dare, Encounters with Power, Authority, and Mystery, which was a book that involved a lot of research and a lot of footnotes. And I was writing it on this little tiny, what now seems like archaic computer that just ran on floppy disks. And I had one chapter that I think had 93 footnotes. And every time I got to footnote 92, the disk would fill up and it would crash. And I have to go all the way back and redo them all over again. And when I got done with that, I was like, I am not writing any more nonfiction for a while. Right? I'm going to go do something where the research I do is going to be like backpacking in the mountains. And so I went off and I was interested in the ideas I'd been writing about power and transforming power in nonfiction and also in all the activism I was doing, because the 80s for me were a time of a lot of activism around anti-nuclear and anti-intervention stuff, a lot of direct action and organizing. And I thought, I want to imagine what it would look like if we put these ideals into practice. And so I started envisioning a transformed San Francisco. And then fiction needs conflict to make it alive and interesting. So, what would it look like if the negative trends I see were carried out to their fullest? And I feel bad for this now, but I set that in Southern California, mostly because I grew up there. So, it was the other location I knew well. And then looked at what happens when they clash. And this question that I think also goes through my earlier historical work and Riane Eisler's work of how does a peaceful society resist violence without turning into what it's fighting against? Is that possible? And to me, that's the animating question in The Fifth Sacred Thing. But I look back on it now and go, oh, that book was actually more prophetic in the bad stuff than I like to think. And we're right on track for society to collapse in 2028, which is when it happens in the book. So let's hope we don't quite get there. People think of the book as being beautiful and utopian and optimistic. And in some sense it is, but it's out of a background of a lot of destruction and collapse and pain and suffering that I would hope we can avoid as a society.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is just what strikes me as the value of, you might call, prophetic fiction or visionary fiction, because it allows the possibility of just imagining just ahead.
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes I think these are actual, what's the word, interjections from the future. I sometimes think about that, of whether it's movies that Christopher Nolan had a previous film, a similar fashion. It was kind of like Inception was the concept, right? This idea. But I feel like if the future is trying to actually give us cautionary reflections, like don't go this way because look, this is what you'll find. Their film Civil War, right? It was Alex Garland directed that. I don't know if you saw that, came out somewhat recently as well, depicting civil war in the U.S. And again, it's like eerily close to what's actually there here. And it's not a celebration of like high fives, right? It's actually like, are you sure you want this to happen? Like for the people that are like, yeah, let's do it. So in terms of what you've depicted in The Fifth Sacred Thing, it still might be helpful for the listener who maybe hasn't read it yet, but to sketch the world, just to touch. I could do it as well, but I'd love if you want to just give us a brief sense of what are the forces at work and what's the main conflict.
Well, in The Fifth Sacred Thing, Northern California has become this beautiful, diverse democracy that restores as much environmental balance as is possible after climate change and collapse, where the streets have been turned into gardens, where all the different religions and races are celebrated and honored, where people take care of each other and society is set up for mutual aid and benefit. And Southern California has become a kind of technocratic autocracy where levels of inequality are extreme, where most people are poor and struggling and oppressed, and where it's very militaristic. And the U.S. is splintered, so there's no overarching federal system anymore. And a lot of it takes place around the question of what happens when the South invades the North. The North has not spent any time or resources developing an army or developing weapons. A lot of them are very opposed to violence. So but not all. There's a lot of conflict among people in the North about how to respond. But the question is, how do we respond when we're not going to win if it comes down to an armed conflict? So how else can we respond to this incursion of violence?
Hmm.
And they basically adopt a strategy of non cooperation and ultimately of turning the soldiers against, like recognizing the soldiers themselves are also victims of this system and turning them against their overlords. And I won't
Hmm.
spoil you by telling the ending if you haven't read it. But
Hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. And I was also struck by the depiction of the San Francisco culture, which may be also building upon somewhat of the culture that's present in terms of, I don't know what to call it, more
yeah.
alternative sexual relational dynamics, let's say. But it was striking to me. There is a scene, right, I think with one of the main characters, the women, where she connects with one of the men from the South sexually, and
Yeah.
then turns out he has a partner, and then they have a whole kind of conflict, and she doesn't understand. She's like, what do you mean? Like, this
Uh-huh.
whole idea of a partnership is owned. Like, there's much more sexual liberation, it seems like, within the North, and then the South has this kind of strict, I don't know if it was a Christian sort of ownership model, but it has that
Mhm.
flavor to it. Yeah, and I'm curious for you as well. That seemed important to not put them against each other, like one is
Yeah.
better than the other, but there was a reason for that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just honestly, when I wrote it, I was between relationships myself. And so it was the idea of, do we all have to be partnered up? And um, that old 60s theme of, if you can't be with the one you love, love the one you're with. Actually, sure how well that works out in real life, but that's the wonderful thing about fiction. You can explore things that and take them to extremes that maybe don't work out so well in your personal life and see. Maybe they could, maybe they would if we weren't socialized in this way.
Mm.
Uh,
What strikes me as a wider theme, and maybe I'll just offer a quick segue to, I spent 5 years, over the course of 5 years, visiting a community in Portugal called Tamera, which you
oh,
might have
yeah, I
heard,
know.
right? At this
Yeah.
point, yeah. And so I made a film about it with some other filmmakers. It's called The
Uh-huh.
Village of Lovers, actually, because of it's us trying to understand not just their approach to more liberated sexual dynamics, but also their relationship to water and the land and the
Yeah.
intelligence of life. And so for me, there was parallels there. Of course, I was seeing with this community that you'd created, or the North. And so I just want to draw also a parallel to the role of water, right, within the culture, and how you're saying that there was this kind of abundant, tapped wellspring of the water that was present throughout the communal life. And
Yeah.
as the stewards come in, and the stewards is the name of the South Army, right, of coming in with their sort of domination society, that was one of the things they did. They tried to control the water right away.
Mhm.
And again, so there's interesting mythic parallels, right, between water as both the sustenance of life itself, but also as this abundant resource when approached with a certain reverence rather than scarcity. And I wonder if you'd also speak to that and how that relates even to today very clearly.
Well, when you live in California, you really understand the importance of water. And I also happened to be writing Fifth Sacred Thing in the middle of a major drought. So everyone was very water conscious and saving water and conserving water. And it's still, even like literally today, one of the issues in the fires in LA was that there were so many fires, they consumed so much water that they drained the reservoirs very quickly. That the reason the fires are so intense was the rains didn't come when they usually do in November. And it's January, which is usually the height of the rainy season, and still bone dry down there. And we've seen that happen with climate change. We've had a year up here where it didn't rain until February, and it's terrifying. Uh, Up in Sonoma County, where my land is, we're on our own water supply, and so we're constantly monitoring every drop and how much we've got in the water tanks and checking for leaks and how much is coming out of the spring. Um, it's the key to life. Without water, you can't do anything. And water and fire go together because, again, if the land is so dry, then the danger of fire and the risk of fire increases. So,
Mm-hmm.
understanding that and really appreciating and cherishing our water and respecting it, I think is key to having a viable society, especially again in an area like California, where in Northern California we have abundant water, but it comes all in the winter. And we also have one of the longest dry seasons on the planet, normally. Tamara, I've also visited there, and they have a beautiful water system that a permaculturalist named Sepp Holzer put in for them, where they have a series of interconnected chain of ponds and lakes, and leading to a very large lake that collects the rainwater and the runoff water in the winter and actually holds enough water that you can swim there even in the summer. And it is big enough to create its own kind of viable ecosystem. Um, and part of the goal of that is also to hold that water so it sinks in and rehydrates the underground waters, because it's a big issue in Portugal of the drawing down of the underground waters, which is drying out the land, drying out the trees. Portugal, that area is an area of oak forest and oak savanna, very much like California in many ways. And they were saying to me how they thought of themselves as a water scarce area, but when they actually looked at the water they could collect and what the volume of it represented, they realized that they actually had water abundance. It was about how they managed it, took care of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of thinking, I mean, I spend a lot of my time now teaching permaculture. We have an organization called Earth Activist Training, and we have courses in person and online around how we create systems of regeneration, whether they're for the land or for our social systems. And again, that's the underlying idea, is that nature showers us with abundance if we understand how her cycles work and we work with nature instead of attempting to dominate and exploit and control nature.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you looped it around to that, is that for me, realizing, not just me, but others have pointed to the role that myth and the mythologies right of the times play a role in how society relates to, you might even say, the great goddess, right? Mm-hmm. Versus nature as commodity, and how it's such a necessarily important pivot moment, I think, when the realization really clicks, right? That there is no separation, that the fires in LA, for example, are deeply related to, again, the water usage, and deeply related to the burning of carbon. And there's no away within this understanding. Right. Maybe this is also the core of ecofeminism, that there's no away. And as we dominate the planet, so we introduce the conditions of scarcity when the nature's like primal essence is actually abundance. So I wonder if you might speak to that as well, because I know you've done a ton on again, like bringing forth the goddess earth-based spirituality, but how important that is in terms of like reliving the reciprocal relationship over and over, like what the role of culture and myth is in like continuing to cultivate that understanding.
Yeah, I began my career, I guess, looking at this question of what does it mean of how we conceive of the sacred. If the sacred is always conceived of not just as male, I think when I began, I really saw it as a gender thing of male versus female, and the idea of a goddess, of being able to see the divine in female form, was tremendously empowering to me when I first encountered it, when I was 17 in my first year of college, and my friend Patty and I did a project together on witchcraft and met some practicing witches, and they were talking about a religion of the goddess, and I was like, wow, whoever thought of that? I grew up Jewish. There was no, at that time, there weren't even yet any women rabbis, let alone goddesses. But as I grew deeper into it, I began to see the importance wasn't so much just that there, it's not like there's a big lady in the sky. It was about revaluing this life and this earth and the processes that bring life into being, and seeing that as the embodiment of the sacred. And I think at one time, one of my housemates was having a baby, and she actually had it up in our ritual room, and it was a beautiful home birth, and her older daughter was there. And a few days afterwards, her older daughter, who was about 2 at the time, was in my bedroom, and I had all these goddess images, and some of them were goddesses giving birth. And she was looking at them and saying, "Baby coming out. Yes, that's right." And looking at these big bellied goddesses. And I realized, to her, here are these images of the sacred that perfectly reflect the most powerful, dramatic life experience she's had so far of her sister being born. And it's completely congruent. There's no distortion, no separation. And so I think of earth based spirituality. It's not about believing in some supernatural thing you can't see. It's about looking at these amazing everyday miracles that we can see, like a new being coming into the world, or like the leaves falling from a tree and decaying and feeding the roots that are going to grow new leaves. And appreciating that with a sense of awe and wonder and reverence. That to me is the core of spirituality. And so there's also no dichotomy between that and science. Science is just the more quantified way we learn more about it.
You made me wonder then, and again, this is perhaps both a experiment and just disciplined wonder or surmising the sense of what was the draw away from that, right? If we think historically, mythically, if that's the way of, and there's certain authors, and maybe you've spoken to it too, but like, what was the like, hey, this will be even better, let's follow a sky god or whatever it was. Like, what do you think? What was the false path there that drew away that understanding for folks?
I think both Rihanna Eisler and I came to similar understandings that it really goes back to warfare becoming organized and endemic. And you can see that in ancient Mesopotamia, where part of it was conditions that made organized warfare, like they gave it a competitive advantage, you could say, in evolutionary terms. Tribes had always gone to war, but they were tribal skirmishes, and they usually didn't involve conquest of the other's territory or enslavement. But in Mesopotamia, when you started to have massive irrigation projects and you had a kind of land that could be made fertile from that kind of vast cultural project, then you could do something with all those captives and you could grow enough food to feed them. And as warfare becomes more endemic, then you have to figure, how do you actually motivate men to go to war? Because it's kind of counterintuitive, especially, again, it's not just like you get on your horse and you go out and have a fun raid at the enemy and count some coup and then run back home. This is like you stand there in a line with chariots thundering down on you and you don't move, even if you're the one the chariot is thundering down upon, like, because the whole success of it depends on that line not breaking. And that requires a strong cultural conditioning. And part of that conditioning is to make your value dependent on your willingness to both exhibit courage and obey authority. And to do that, you need both reward and fear. The reward was plunder, and part of that reward then became access to the bodies of the women of the enemy and rape. And the fear was, oh, then if you don't do this, you are like a woman. You aren't a real man. And so you get this divergence between what masculinity is seen as and what femininity is seen as. And women start to lose their sexual agency. So again, you have the early myths where Inanna is singing the praises of her vulva, and you have the later myths, like the myth of Gilgamesh, where they take a priestess of the temple and basically stake her out in the forest to attract the wild man as bait. Right? And we're still dealing with that today. And I think that is the tragedy of masculinity, that when men are told to be a man means to be aggressive and not compassionate, and to be where the only emotion really allowable to you is anger, and you're not allowed to feel tenderness or grief or sadness or compassion, where your relations with women inherently are coercive, that destroys any possibility of really having a real mutual loving relationship with a woman or anybody else.
This strikes me as that a certain masculinity is pressed into service of vaster force, and we might call this the force of war.
Yeah.
And instigated by environmental change and technology. Like, it's interesting, right? As at the beginning of this conversation, we began to speak a bit about what is that hyper object that is actually much bigger than any of the interpersonal dynamics of gender. And therefore, my question too is, if we no longer live in that kind of world, like, or maybe we do in some degrees. If you look at what's going on in Russia and the Ukraine or something, for example, right? I mean, there's a sense that, yeah, warriors are needed because bigger warriors are always standing at the gate, ready to invade. And in some places that still may be true because we have tyrants essentially enacting their ego fantasies en masse. And yet, what would you say is the invitation for stepping or cultivating a different response, a different kind of masculinity? You know, you've touched on it in various aspects here, and I'm just left with that final line in that quote that Shepherd Bliss seemed to attribute it to you, which was calling for men to be able to truly love.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder what that, I'd love if you could end there, if we could speak to that, of what you meant, I mean, then, and what you might mean now.
Well, I would say there are plenty of opportunities for men to use some of those things that have been sort of attributed to masculinity, like raw physical courage, physical strength, that just in firefighting alone. Or, I always tell my permaculture students, never let your feminism make you think that you should try to lift a big heavy rock if some guy is willing to do it, right? Nature created testosterone and upper body strength for a purpose, right? And there's plenty of purposes to put that to use that involve regenerating the life and the environment around us. And I like the way John Liu, the filmmaker, frames it as the great work of our time is really to repair and regenerate the land and the ecosystems. And I strongly believe that if we do that, if we take that up, that will also have an impact on climate change and on everything else. And to truly love is to care about some other being's welfare, to strive to see them as who they are in their fullness and complexity, not to reduce them to an object, to take responsibility for nurturing and caring for them, even when it might not be the most convenient thing for yourself, whether that's caring for the earth or caring for another human being. And again, I see men around me all the time that are doing that are capable of doing that are caring for their kids, that are caring for their partners, that are tending the land and caring for the land. And it's a beautiful thing. Also makes it possible again, to truly have a loving relationship.
A good place to end, I think, on our beautiful conversation. Thank you, Starhawk, for your time.
Thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Mythic Masculine. If you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and share on your social media. Once again, you're also invited to find The Mythic Masculine on Substack. You'll be able to subscribe to forthcoming episodes, as well as become a paid supporter. Visit themythicmasculine.com to learn more.